Steve Shirilla says there is no way his daughter crashed that car on purpose to hurt Dominic or Davion. But listen closely, because in that sentence, he leaves someone out. And Chris Cuomo catches it. Hi, I'm Stina. Welcome back to Motive and Method, or welcome if you're new here. I want to get the disclaimers out of the way. As usual, I'm not a mental health professional. My background is in communication, both written and verbal. The views expressed in this and all of my videos are my opinion based on publicly available information. On this channel, I look at true crime through language, framing, and patterns. Not just what people say, but how they say it, what they emphasize, and sometimes what they leave out. Today, I'm looking at Steve Shirilla's interview with Chris Cuomo, and specifically how that interview seems to protect a particular family frame around Mackenzie, who she was, what she was capable of, and how responsibility gets redirected. Before we get into it, I wanted to let you know that channel memberships are now available. If you'd like to support more long-form analysis like this, you can hit join below. No pressure at all. Watching, liking, commenting, and sharing already helps so much. Now, let's start with one of the first moments that stood out to me in this interview. Cuomo is pressuring Steve on whether Mackenzie may have crashed the car on purpose. Listen to Steve's answer, specifically who he names and who he doesn't.
There is no way that my daughter crashed that car on purpose to hurt Dominic or Davion.
Did you notice the name missing in Steve's answer? Cuomo did. Steve answers by focusing on Dominic and Davion. He says there is no way Mackenzie would have intentionally hurt them. But Cuomo catches the omission in real time. Steve didn't include Mackenzie in that answer. And that matters, actually, because the question was not only whether she meant to hurt Dominic or Davion. There was another possibility sitting beside Steve's answer. So, Cuomo follows that thread and asks the question Steve's answer leaves hanging. Was there any chance Mackenzie crashed a car to hurt herself? That is not a random follow-up either. It comes directly from the way Steve answered. Now, listen to how Steve answers that question.
Not one bit. Not one bit. She loved life.
What stands out to me here is the certainty. Steve does not say, "I don't believe that," or "I never saw signs of that." He didn't say, "As her father, I can't imagine that." He answers with total certainty. No, not at all. Not one bit. She loved life. Although Steve appears to be talking about Mackenzie's mental state at the time of the crash, the certainty here, especially the phrase "she loved life," reaches further than that. It implies that self-harm was unthinkable, that it never happened, that it was not even part of the picture. That's exactly what stands out to me, because by this point, Steve would have known about the receipts. There was a police report documenting that Steve himself had called emergency services a few years ago because Mackenzie was reportedly threatening self-harm. And during the trial, Steve certainly heard about the text messages to Dom in which Mackenzie threatened self-harm multiple times, as well as harm to Dom, but that is another story, of course. So, when Steve gives such a firm answer, the question becomes, is that based on evidence, or is it part of the family's protective frame? Because those are not the same thing. After that, Steve offers what sounds like evidence for that firm answer. Now listen closely to how he explains it.
We even had somebody after the crash did a suicide test or a questionnaire with her. And that person said that she was not suicidal.
This part matters because Steve seems to be using this questionnaire as evidence that Mackenzie was not intending to hurt herself. But the way he describes it raises questions. The vagueness of the response. He says somebody. He says a test or a questionnaire. He said that person said Mackenzie was not in that mental state. But who was this person? When exactly was this questionnaire given? Was it done at the hospital? Was it done before or after investigators had the full crash data? And what was Mackenzie actually being asked in that moment? Because my understanding is that immediately after the crash, this was believed to be a tragic accident. So the timing matters here. If that questionnaire was done early, before the crash was being viewed as intentional, then at most it may tell us what Mackenzie reported at that moment. But it does not automatically answer the bigger question of what was happening before impact. And if it was done later, after questions had already started building around intent, then it becomes even less useful as proof of her mindset during the crash. So, yes, the questionnaire is important. It does matter if one actually exists. But even then, the key question is whether it supports what Steve is claiming. And either way, it raises questions Steve does not answer. Then Steve gives another reason Mackenzie could not have been thinking of harming herself. Listen to this clip and how he moves from Mackenzie herself to what the family would have known.
And if my daughter was suicidal, my wife would know. My wife talked with my daughter about everything. My daughter told my wife everything. There's no way that is an absolute fabrication to lie.
This is one of the most important moments in the interview, in my opinion, because Steve is not just saying, I don't believe Mackenzie intended to hurt herself. He is saying there is no possible way she could have been in that state because his wife would have known. This is a very different claim. And listen to the layering here. My wife would know. My wife talked with my daughter about everything. My daughter told my wife everything. That is 3 statements in a row, all trying to establish the same idea. If Mackenzie had been in that state, the family would have known, according to Steve. But that is not necessarily evidence. That is a family belief. And it may be sincere. He may completely believe it. But saying we would have known is not the same thing as there was nothing hidden. People hide things from the people closest to them all the time, especially about self-harm ideation. So, when Steve follows that with, there's no way, that is an absolute fabrication, it's a lie, that becomes more than a denial. It becomes an attempt to shut the door completely. And this is where the family frame becomes really visible. The argument is not just Mackenzie was not trying to hurt herself. It becomes we would have known if she was. And those are not the same claim. One is about Mackenzie's state of mind. The other is about the family's ability to know and to account for that state of mind. That is why the intensity here matters, because this question does not only affect how we understand Mackenzie, it affects how we understand what the family may have seen, what they may have missed, and what they now need the public to believe. And one more thing to notice here. These last few clips are all answering one central question. Was Mackenzie possibly trying to hurt herself? That is a question Cuomo asked. And Steve does not just answer it once. He gives several layers of answers. No, Not at all. Not one bit. She loved life. Then there was a questionnaire. Then his wife would have known. Then Mackenzie told his wife everything. Then there is no way. Then it is an absolute fabrication. Then it is a lie. Now, that does not automatically mean deception. I want to be careful about that. But in communication analysis, when someone keeps adding layers to one answer, it can be worth asking why. Because sometimes an overbuilt answer is not just answering the question. Sometimes it is trying to close it. And while we're on the topic of the self-harm question, there is another piece of this that makes Steve's certainty more complicated. Annie Elise covered this case back when it first happened, and according to her, she received documents connected to the investigation at that time.
In this police report, her dad said that Mackenzie did this intentionally.
That is a major contradiction of Steve's claim. I want to be careful with this detail. From what I understand, this was not in the main Metro Health police report Annie Elise had obtained. It appears to have come from a Metro Health police sergeant, later recounting what Steve allegedly said shortly after the crash. But even with that caution, it still matters, because according to what Annie Elise discussed, Steve allegedly said shortly after the crash that Mackenzie had done this intentionally and was trying to take her own life. That is very, very different from saying later, there is no way. It is a lie. And I'm not saying this one detail proves intent by itself. I'm saying it complicates the certainty. Because when someone later gives an absolute denial, it matters if there was an earlier statement closer to the crash that pointed in the opposite direction. Now, Cuomo shifts to another important part of the interview. He asks Steve about the criticism that he and his wife were too permissive or too lenient when it came to Mackenzie. And this is important because now we move from Mackenzie's intent to the family system around her. Listen to how Steve answers the parenting question.
Was I lenient on some things? Yes. Was I harder on some things? Yes. I was raising my kid how I felt best at the time that I made decisions.
This answer starts with what sounds like accountability. Steve acknowledges that, yes, he was lenient in some things, but then he immediately balances it with, was I harder on some things? Yes, he says. So, even the admission gets softened. It is not simply, yes, I was too lenient. It becomes, I was lenient sometimes, but I was also hard sometimes. That is a very human answer, of course, but it is also a defensive structure because it keeps the answer from staying fully on the criticism. Instead of sitting with the possibility that permissiveness may have played a role, he turns it into a balance sheet. Lenient here, harder there. But the larger question is not whether he ever set limits. The question is whether the limits were meaningful enough for the pattern that was actually unfolding. Then Steve moves from explaining his parenting choices to defending his identity as a parent.
I'm not a bad parent.
This is where the framing shifts. Cuomo's question is about whether the parenting was too permissive. But Steve's answer becomes, I'm not a bad parent. And those are not the same question. Someone can make bad parenting decisions without being a bad parent, without that absolute. Someone can love their child deeply and still fail to set the limits that child needed. So when Steve says, I'm not a bad parent, I hear that as a defensive moment. He is responding to the emotional accusation underneath the question, not just the question itself. he is not only defending what he did, he is defending who he is. And once the conversation becomes, I'm not a bad parent, the focus shifts away from the pattern and onto the self-protection. But the real issue is not whether Steve loved Mackenzie. The issue is whether the family system around Mackenzie allowed serious behavior to keep being minimized, excused, or reframed. Then Steve explains how he chose which battles to fight.
I picked fights that I felt would help her, and I picked fights that I didn't want to fight with her, and I let her go and make her own decisions. And,
On its own, picking your battles can sound reasonable. Every parent does that to some extent. But in this case, the question is which battles were being picked and which ones were being avoided. Because when there is a pattern of reckless driving, volatile conflict, threats, or dangerous behavior, those are not ordinary teenage choices. Those are not small battles. Those are safety issues. So when Steve says he picked the fights he thought would help Mackenzie and let other things go, that raises a much bigger question to me. What exactly was being let go? Because letting her make her own decisions sounds empowering and a normal coming-of-age story. But when the decision involves cars, speed, emotional volatility, and other people's lives, that phrase lands very differently. At that point, it's not just independence. It may be permissiveness dressed up as independence. Then Steve gives an analogy that really stood out to me. Listen to this.
she was almost an adult, almost 18 at that point. My daughter was a lot like me. I learned things by doing them, and rather than being told, don't touch the stove. I had to go touch the stove to figure out that it was hot.
This analogy is doing a lot of work. Steve connects two ideas here. Mackenzie was almost 18, and she had to learn things the hard way. So the frame becomes, Mackenzie was nearly an adult, she was making her own decisions, and some lessons had to come through consequences. On the surface, that can sound like a normal explanation too. But parenting does not begin when a child is almost 18. By that point, the patterns around boundaries, consequences, car access, conflict, and what behavior gets tolerated have already been forming for years. So, when Steve says she was almost an adult, that may explain why control was harder by then. But it does not erase the question of what had already been allowed, minimized, or avoided before then. And that is why the touch the stove analogy stood out to me, because it frames Mackenzie's behavior as independence, stubbornness, or learning by consequences. But in this case, the consequences were not contained to Mackenzie. This was not just a teenager touching a stove and getting burned. This was a pattern involving cars, speed, substances, emotional escalation, threats, and other people's lives. So the question becomes, what was being treated like a stove? And who else could get burned? I want to end with one more moment from Cuomo's interview. Cuomo points out that Steve seems bothered by negative attention his family is getting. But instead of staying with that question, the public backlash, the criticism, the way people are reacting to the family, Steve circles right back to the crash itself. And this is where, to me, the framing gets very revealing.
It was an accident. There's 4.74 seconds of black box information and nothing else. That's all it is. It's nothing.
This moment stood out to me because Cuomo's question was about the negative attention to the family. But Steve goes right back to the crash. And not just the crash. He goes back to minimizing the evidence. It was an accident. 4.74 seconds of black box information. Nothing else. It's nothing. That is a lot of reduction packed into a very short answer. Because those 4.74 seconds are not nothing. Those seconds are part of why this case was not treated as just a tragic accident. They are part of why the prosecution argued intent. And they are part of a larger picture. The speed, the churn, the lack of braking, the acceleration, and the context leading up to impact. So, when Steve says it's nothing, that is not just a factual disagreement. That is framing. He is taking an important piece of evidence and shrinking it down until it sounds meaningless. And that fits the larger pattern we've seen throughout this interview. When the issue is Mackenzie's possible state of mind, the answer is no way. When the issue is whether the family would have known, the answer is, of course we would have known. When the issue is parenting, the answer is, I'm not a bad parent. And when the issue is black box data, the answer is, it's nothing. Over and over, the pattern is not just defensive. It is reduction. Reduce the concern, reduce the evidence, reduce the parenting questions, reduce the pattern, reduce the crash to 4.74 seconds and call it nothing. But this case is not nothing. Dominic Russo and Davian Flanagan lost their lives. Mackenzie was convicted. 15 years to life. And the language around this case still matters because framing can either move people closer to accountability or further away from it. And that's why this interview stood out to me. Not because Steve Shirilla is the only parent who would defend his child. Most parents would, of course. But there is a difference between grief, denial, and a public narrative that keeps sanding down the hardest parts of the case. Because when every serious question becomes, no way, we would have known, I'm not a bad parent, or it's nothing, the result is a story where accountability keeps getting pushed out of the frame. And that is a pattern I wanted to look at here. Let me know what you think in the comments. Do you hear this as a grieving father defending his daughter? Do you hear it as denial? Or do you hear something else happening in the framing? If you found this breakdown helpful, please like, subscribe, and consider joining the channel for extra perks and behind-the-scenes updates. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.